All right, thank you, Elaine. Welcome everyone to today's Tips and Tricks webinar. And today we're going to cover some of the stuff that happens behind the scenes under the hood of the WatchGuard, some of the default settings that we do for security reasons that will help you help protect you from the network, help block some of those scans and attacks that might be coming in. So the title of this is Default Threat Protection Explained. And so here, as we go into this, we're going to cover some of those things that the firewall, most of these are defaults, but I will offer a few suggestions for tweaks and try and get you a little more insight as to what's happening behind the screen with this. Now, if any of you have been through a PCI audit with a WatchGuard firewall, you might have run into a scenario where you've come in, they've started their scan, and they're trying to do a vulnerability scan from the outside of your network, and they start hitting your firewall, and the next thing you know, you get a call from your auditor saying, hey, you've blocked us, we can't run our assessment against you. And this is a great feature of the WatchGuard, and I always tell people, yeah, make sure you get it in writing. What happened, that basically when they started their assessment and their security scan against you, the default threat protection on the firewall kicked in and prevented them from accessing and scanning your network. And in most cases, what you have to do is you have to add them to the exceptions list to allow them to run the scan, even though you should have just passed with flying colors because they tried to do a vulnerability scan, that you detected it and you blocked them and kept them from getting into your network. So as we do this, there'll be a little bit of PowerPoint along with this, but I want to actually start out not with the PowerPoint, but just in our policy manager and show you some of the settings that I'm talking about here. So all of these, everything that we're going to be talking about today is going to be in your policy manager, under setup and default threat protection. If you're used to the web UI, you have the same entry, the default threat protection, that will get you into these settings. And I'm actually going to start from the bottom up. With this, under the default threat protection, we have three different options. Default packet handling, which is where we're going to spend most of our time, but I want to quickly go through blocked ports and blocked sites to cover what's in here, because there's a couple of settings that you'll want to get turned on right away. By the way, thank you to Tim, who did ask for this to be covered in the Tech Tips and Trips webinars. So again, if you guys, as we wrap up, please feel free to write in the comments section the questions, anything else you'd like to see for upcoming webinars. So with that said, let's get going here. The bottom entry here is the block ports, and the reason why I want to start here is there's one very important checkbox. This should be, as a general rule, if you're setting up a new firewall, this should be one of the first things that you get in and turn on. By default, this box is not checked. What this says is that this is automatically blocked sites that try to use blocked ports. So we have our default port list. The default port list actually looks like that. I have one extra in there. But this basically says if somebody connects to you on any of these ports, if they connect to you on port 1 is not a valid port for any internet communication. We know other ports are good, you know, port 25, port 80, port 443. This is looking at ports that are should not be used for any valid traffic. So the list here goes back quite a few years. Some of these things in here go to old RPC calls that had some vulnerabilities back in the Unix days, where you get some of these 6,000 ports. But really the important thing in here that I want to stress, that this should be turned on every firewall out there, is to automatically block sites that try to use blocked ports. That way, if somebody is connecting to you on a port that they should not be, the firewall is going to detect that, and they're going to cut it off right away. Now, one of the things that I had in there, I went ahead and port 33434. This is actually a scanning and mapping tool that I found out about. I never had heard of port 33434 being used. So I see it all the time in my logs though, so that I get hit from China, from Brazil, from Russia, coming into port 33434, and I did some research, and so I've added that in. So this is a good place if you know there are ports out there that you know you're getting attacked on. Make sure you add those in here to this list. So, but the important thing again, make sure you block the sites that are trying to use those ports. The other menu in here that we'll spend not a whole lot of time on, but is the blocked sites. Blocked sites is if you have somebody that is hitting a site that you don't want them to, something that I've had a few comments in here that I keep getting RDP denial of service attacks on, somebody hit a malicious website, somebody hit RDP brute force login from this IP address. So these are sites that I've added into my blocked sites list. Now, in the case of where you have the auditors that are trying to do your scan against them, what you need to do is you need to get their IP address and add their either IP address, host name. We can now do fully qualified domain names and add those in here as well. That way, if anybody is in this list, they are not going to be blocked no matter what kind of behavior the firewall detects. The last section in here is the auto block list. The auto block time. This is basically when sites are auto blocked, how long do you want them to be blocked for? The default setting in here is 20 minutes. I go a little crazy with my setting and I turn it up to 90 minutes just because I want to have it show up and blocked. You can view these if you come out to your Firebox System Manager, your blocked sites. I keep that list up there so that if I hit somebody that has a specific address or a blocked port, I do that 90 minutes so that when I'm doing these demos, I have a better chance of those showing up in here. 30 to 60 minutes is a better value to put in here, but I can actually see somebody at an address 198.20.69.98, whatever that happens to be, hit me on a blocked port that they shouldn't have. They've been blocked for the last 45 minutes. They're going to expire in another 45 minutes. So with that, those two sections covered, let's just jump into the last section, and we'll cover some of the PowerPoints here with this. So the last section of this is the default threat protection, and this is where we'll spend some time just talking about what these different sections are, what they deal with, the best thing to set with them are. Very first section in here is drop spoofing attacks. Now, what is a spoofing attack? So we'll jump back to the PowerPoints for just a little bit. IP spoofing is the creation of packets with a forged source IP address. Basically, people use this to conceal their identity and use it to launch denial of service attacks. Just an illustration of this, you've got an attacker sitting at IP address, he's at 1111. He creates a packet on his firewall that says, I want to go to destination 2222, but he sets his source IP, the destination of the traffic, as address 3333. So he goes out through the internet, he hits an internet router. That router in our next step here takes us to, says, I will need to get to destination 2222. He's getting there, it hits destination 2222. That victim, whoever he's attacking, it sends a response back, says, I'm sorry, there's no valid host here, or it's not permitted, or whatever, destination unreachable, whatever error message he might be sending back. Well, those error messages that he's sending back actually end up getting redirected over to this other host, 3333, because that's what the IP address was listed as the source of the traffic. So that, in a quick nutshell, is what a spoofing attack is used for, what a spoofing attack does. So when when you have this checkbox, and again, all of these checkboxes are enabled by default on the firewall to drop spoofing attacks and to drop these other ones. and I'm going to make that just a little bit smaller to make it easier to jump back and forth. When that box is checked, basically what the firewall does is it checks the source IP address of every packet that passes through and makes sure it aligns up with the specified interface. And it does both ingress and egress. On ingress filtering, people starting out on the outside of your firewall sending traffic in, this spoofing attack prevents them from putting a source IP address in their packet as an internal address, something that they would try and do to attack an internal website. Egress filtering, outbound filtering, prevents anybody that maybe has a compromised PC on their network to actually launch a spoofing attack outbound. So this spoofing will go both inbound and outbound. So if you see something in your Firebox System Manager when you're looking at your traffic monitor, if you see anything about IP spoofing, you'll know that is what's going on. Something on your network's been compromised. Somebody's sending out a packet with a bad IP address in that doesn't, your internal network, mine is 10.20.30.x. If all of a sudden I'm sending out packets that say they're coming from 10.10, it's going to block those and prevent those from leaving the network. Okay, the next checkbox in here, let me get back to our default threat protection, is IP source route. What is drop IP source route? Well, with normal routing, what happens is each router will examine the destination IP address and choose the next hop to forward the packet to. With source routing, the user, and this is actually not necessarily a flaw, this was written into the TCP/IP standards. It's part of the protocol, but basically what the source does, the sender, is he says, as I traverse the network, I am going to go on these specific hops. It takes the decision out of the router's hand and says, I will traverse this path to my destination. Now, this might be important on an internal network if you need to make sure you've got multiple paths, multiple gateways out to the world, and you need to make sure something goes through that direction. Coming in from the outside, though, this is never a good thing on your network. Attackers can use the source routing to try and probe through your network, or they can also use source routing to say that I know there is a security appliance, I know there's a content filter, I know there's something here between me and the hop or the device that I want to attack. I want to go around that on my hops, and that way they can use this source routing to bypass a security device that you might have on your network. So by turning off this IP source routing, is basically the WatchGuard firewall. Anytime a TCP/IP packet, and this isn't as common as some of these other attacks we'll see, but anytime we see source routing inside of a packet, the firewall is going to drop that and not allow that to communicate through. Now, the next two are block port space probes and address space probes. And the default settings in here are actually 10 and 10. I like to change mine to a lower value because I'll explain why as we go into the definitions of these and what they're doing. So port space probe is TCP or UDP traffic that is sent to a range of ports. So if you think of doing Angry IP scanner or something, you want to see what that host has available. Is port 80 open? Is port 3389 open? Is port 443 open? So you send from a single host, you send multiple packets on different ports to see what's out there. So what the XTM firewall does is it counts the number of packets sent from an IP address to any of the interfaces on the firewall. So the port space probe, think of it as hitting, they're going to hit port. If it's just an automated scan, they might start at port 1, which in that case, our default packet handling the blocked ports will hit it. But say they start at port 21, 22, something for FTP, and then they start going through multiple ports, either random or in order. They hit 21, 22, 23, jump to 53 for DNS, jump to 80. Basically, the device is going to connect the number of packets sent from a single IP address and then once it reaches this threshold, at that point, it's going to stop allowing connections for that port space. Now, the address probe is a little bit different, but this is basically they're starting to scan your public IPs, your internal IPs, to see what IPs actually respond. And this is basically the address space probe is identified when a single host sends a specified number of packets, whatever your number is there, to different IP addresses assigned to any of the interfaces on the box. So when we look at that, think about port space probes. Do you really want them hitting 10 different ports before we block them out? I like to lower these to 3 in both cases, because if they've hit port 80, they hit port 443, they hit port 3389, they start hitting all of these random ports, I don't want them talking anymore, because I'm pretty sure I don't have any server that has more than 3 ports open. If you do have a service that runs multiple ports, you might need to increase that value a little bit. But then also think about your address space probes. Most small businesses that I've ever worked with, when they'll either get a single IP address or they'll get a block of 5 IP addresses. Those 5 IP addresses are on the outside of the firewall, and so think about the default there. We don't block an address space probe until the 11th hit. Well, they've already scanned all of your public IPs to see what's there, so that's why I like to lower that value down, so that if I've got a block of 5 addresses, if you hit 3 of those in a row, I'm going to block you as you're trying to scan and do something through here. So the next section that we look at is the IPsec, all of these flood attacks. So the flood attacks, as we jump back here, is basically a form of a denial of service attack where a attacker is going to try and flood your firewall, overwhelm the firewall with different things. So it can be any of these types of traffic. IPsec and IKE are all related to encryption and VPN tunnels. So when they do those, they're just flooding your firewall with requests for some kind of encryption or a tunnel to come up. ICMP, the ping of death. Anytime, think about your firewall, anytime if you've got things set up that it's responding to pings, or somebody's trying to ping you with an address that's unreachable, every time the firewall is required, ICMP standard says, you send back a destination unreachable. So if somebody starts hitting you enough, it's going to consume all of your resources, and you're no longer able to respond to legitimate traffic. The other ones in there, UDP is the same thing. If they hit you just with UDP traffic, it is going to return that ICMP destination unreachable. The SYN flood attack, that is actually, think of the 3-way handshake. That's this guy right here, the SYN flood attack. That's the 3-way handshake. Somebody sends you a request for a connection, they send you the SYN packet, your firewall replies with a SYN-ACK packet, and the other end actually responds with the ACK. So you've got the SYN-ACK that establishes the handshake that says, hey, we're going to communicate, we know how to talk to each other. So if they start flooding you with those SYN messages, your firewall could end up responding to so many of those, it's going to drop legitimate traffic or be so overwhelmed that it can't do that. Now, these are all looking at number of packets per second. In most cases, we don't really have the need to change these defaults, especially on something like a SYN flood attack. A SYN attack, or a normal SYN communication, is how every TCP/IP handshake starts, so you don't want to have that value very low, or you're going to end up blocking normal traffic that you would see trying to connect to you. And these are looking at total across the firewall. They are not looking at individual IP addresses sending these, because denial of service attacks can come from multiple places at one time. It just counts, are we getting more than 5,000 SYNs per second, SYN packets a second, then we know we're probably under some kind of flood attack, and we'll start dropping the subsequent ones after that. So Jumping down to the next section here, auto block source of packets not handled. So source of packets not handled, basically an unhandled packet is a packet that does not match any policy rule on the firewall. And by default, there's an implicit deny in the firewall that says if I don't have a rule that allows this traffic through, I am going to block this. Now, auto block source of packets, this is actually one of those, it's off by default, and I recommend that you not check this. And the reason for that is this can cause some problems with your DNS traffic. Think about your firewall or your domain controller sending DNS requests out. It's going to have a list of DNS servers that it uses. And it might go to one, or it goes to the root hint somewhere, sends a DNS request out, and that, because of whatever network conditions exist outside your network, you don't get a response back right away. The firewall or the domain controller ends that connection, sends the DNS request off to the next DNS server in the list, the next root hint, the next forward, or whatever it happens to be. So because of that, it ended the first session and then sent off a new one. Well, when the first request finally does come back to you, all of a sudden that's going to come back as an unhandled packet because the firewall or the domain controller ended the first connection, went on to another one. So with that, we see if you start having funky problems with DNS where DNS stops resolving for a time period, it could be because you've got this auto block source of packets not handled. It'd be great to be able to block everybody that we have out there that tries to hit us that doesn't match our rules. But unfortunately, it can cause, just due to the nature of some of the communications we make, it can cause problems. The next one is also not checked by default, but send an error message to clients whose connections are disabled. So what this does, I actually have a little bit of an illustration here in the PowerPoint. And this is basically, think about what happens when you send a ping to somebody. And in fact, we'll bring up a command prompt here and talk about a first one. When you try and ping somebody, what happens? If I ping Cisco.com, I'll get a response, reply from whatever, hey, I know Cisco's up. If I do the same thing to Microsoft.com, if I ping Microsoft.com, what happens? Basically, it resolves the IP address, but then I get request timed out, request timed out, request timed out. This is because the firewall, whatever firewall is in front of Microsoft.com, it is set to ignore pings. So it's basically a timeout. The firewall, whatever router on the other end, does not respond to that ping, so it sends back something that just is a timeout because it's ignoring the ping request. Well, our next scenario is if the destination is unreachable. This is different than the timeout. If I ping something on my network that I know does not exist right now, I'm going to get a response back that actually says destination host unreachable. Whatever my, in this case, because I'm pinging something local to me, it's coming from my own IP address. But if I were pinging something across the internet, a page that didn't exist, or there was a break in the cable, something wasn't down, or something wasn't connected properly, as in our second connection here, the ping response actually sends back differently. It sends back destination host unreachable. So what checking this box does on the firewall, if you check the box that says send an error message to clients whose connections are disabled, basically what that is doing is that is crafting a destination unreachable response to try and fool hacking tools. Now, chances are it's not going to fool a person who is live on the other end if somebody's doing this actively, but if it is an automated tool, an automated script that is running a ping attack across here, and they're getting this destination host unreachable, that automated tool, by checking this box, is going to report and say, hey, there's nothing at that IP address. So I've used this before, and I think I've talked about this on past webinars, but it's what I call security by obscurity. If we can hide our presence a little bit, we're that much better off and keeping our lower profile to the outside world. All right, that brings us down to the last distributed denial of service. So this is the DDoS protection, similar to denial of service attack, but rather than coming from one host, it is coming from multiple hosts. And so with that, let's just jump to our last section here. Distributed denial of service, somebody out there on the other end has control of a bot network or multiple hosts. They're infected with a virus, and they use that to launch an attack on your network. So there are two settings here. There is a per server quota and a per client quota. Per server quota handles inbound connections to you. Per client quota handles outbound connections from your network. So the per server quota is, when it looks at that, it is the number of connections per second from any external source to the Firebox external interface. Now this includes connections coming to addresses that have good NAT rules written, that are policies allowing inbound access. So it is based on the number of connection requests to any one destination IP, no matter where they're coming from. So if the public IP on your firewall hits, the default is 100. If the 101st connection request in a second to the same IP address is going to be dropped after that. And then once we reach the 1 second, the time starts over, and it will start counting those again. So this is from the outside in, 100 connections per second, and in some cases you might need to increase this value. In cases where you have a public-facing website that is getting a lot of traffic, or something that maybe you have a voice over IP phone system that the actual PBX box is sitting outside your network. I know PBX is not quite the right term to use with voice over IP, but your phone server is sitting outside of your network. It's a hosted solution, but you've got a very active call center, a lot of inbound calls coming in. You might need to up this quota a little bit to allow for more inbound connections per second. The per client quota is also the same way, but this is looking at outbound connections per second from any source protected by the Firebox. So this is preventing somebody from compromising your network and launching an outbound denial of service attack. It is based on a single IP address regardless of the destination. So if one IP address inside your network starts flooding the firewall with a lot of requests, either to a single source or to multiple different sources, this is going to look at and prevent those from going out of your network. The per client quota says I can't have more than 100 connections per second outbound. 101st connection from a single IP address is going to be blocked. Now, again, in cases where you might need to block that, say your voice over IP server is sitting outside the network, you've got somebody making a lot of calls out, where they might be making lots of different connections, lots of different ports to a server sitting on the outside, you might want to consider jumping these rules up. It's the one I see people adjusting more than anything is the per server quota, that inbound thing, for those public-facing websites. So with that said, it's one of those things that the defaults in most cases will handle the threats just fine. If you run into a specific scenario where you find intermittent drops, might be something that you want to block and prevent from coming in. So that covers our default packet handling. Again, the logging button, all of these different attacks in here, everything that I click through, other than the broadcasts, which we aren't as concerned with, all of these are going to be logged by default. The unhandled and internal packets, we can, if we want to turn those off. we can, but I do recommend if you're using the dimension logging server, the more information you log, the better your reports are going to be. So with that said, thank you guys again for attendance. As always, let me just bring this up here real quick. I do record these webinars. They will be on YouTube. If you go out to YouTube and search for WGSE, and there it finally goes, gives me my menu, my channel. If you search for D. Geisler WGSE, if I could type my name properly, you will find the South Central tips and tricks videos. This one will be posted out here within a day or so. There is the channel if you want to get updates when new videos are posted out here. So with that said, again, please, if you've got any suggestions about future webinars that you'd like to see, please leave those in the comments. Please leave any questions in the comments as well. I will answer those over the next day or so and make sure I get that information back to you as quickly as possible. With that said, I'll turn things back over to Elaine, and thank you guys very much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. Another great session. That's it for today, everyone. I will leave the webinar up for just a minute in case you guys have any additional questions for Dan. So thank you for attending. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll speak with you again next month, and Happy New Year to everyone. Bye now.